Well, thank you very much. And thanks for coming out this evening and sharing your evening with us. I'm sure that on this Labor Day weekend, and is this the first weekend of school?
Yes!
You know, on Labor Day weekend, a holiday, your first weekend of school, I'm sure there are so many other things you could be doing instead of sitting here. So we really want to thank you for coming out and sharing your evening with us. And just to sort of pay you guys back, we're going to give you a great show. It's the least we can do for you. And we're here to have a good time, and are you guys even having a good time? I had a feeling. And I don't suppose we have any tap dance or cloggers in the audience, do we? No. I also don't suppose we have any musicians in the audience. Maybe just one or two English literature students. Anyway, like I said, we're here to have a good time and have some fun. And the way we're going to have this fun is with some music that really spans a lot of different traditions and styles, and the percussive step dancing that goes with a lot of these music traditions. And that's really what this is a music and dance show centered around different percussive dance traditions. I like to call percussive step dancing 10-toe percussion. And that's because my attitude about all of this dance is that it's music first. It's all about using your feet, but to be the percussionist. And really, with a lot of traditional music, it is the dancing that adds the percussion. And it expresses the various musics, and I think you'll get this as we go along this evening. And one of the great things about percussive step dancing is that it really is found in many, or some style is found in many different cultures around the world, many different countries. And here in America, we're very fortunate. We have two main categories of percussive stepping. We have clogging and also tap dancing. And what I just began with was a clog dance, but it might be a little bit different from what you're familiar with clogging, because I'm a flat-footed style clogger, or just a flat-footer. Still Appalachian clogging, but a little bit different from the contemporary style of clogging, or what might be considered precision clogging. And I'd like to continue now with a tap dance, another one of the American forms, what I'd like to consider a city cousin to the clogging there, because the tap was more an urban expression and also more jazz or popular music expression. And the tap dance I'm going to do might also be a little bit different from what you're used to as tap, because if you're used to tap dancing from theatrical events or possibly from films, people like Fred Astaire or Gene Kelly, then you're more familiar with a theatrical or a Hollywood style of tap. I represent what's considered a rhythm tap tradition, or what is also known as jazz tap. Now that doesn't mean jazz dance with taps, it means tap dancing to jazz music and being a jazz percussionist. So I'd like to continue with the rhythm tap dance to a good old number that maybe you've heard of, Lady Be Good.
music that's a little bit older than that. It's from a beautiful little island on the east coast of Canada called Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. And this is traditional fiddle music, originally from Scotland. It came over there about 200 years ago, and it's still thriving. So we'll play some Cape Breton tunes, starting with a stress bay and going into some reels.
Well, the step dancing we have in America, both the tap dance styles and the Appalachian clog styles, are here because of various immigrant forms that were brought to America over 100 years ago, probably between 100 and 200 years ago. And in particular, it was the Irish step dancing, the English clog dances, and Scottish step dancing that were brought here. They mixed with each other on American soil, and they were also great influenced by mixing in of African and African American music and dance tradition, as well as Native American music and dance tradition. And it was this mixture of all these different original forms that formed the roots, the beginnings of our American styles, which then took off here in America. And the clogging developed in one direction and the tap dancing in another direction. So I'd like to pay tribute now to one of the parental styles to the American styles, and in particular that is the Irish style of step dancing. And there was a long time, when tap dancing was the most well-known style of percussive dance around the world because of its export from Hollywood, or in Hollywood films, that took it all around the world. But these days, I think Irish step dancing might be the most well-known style of step dancing, perhaps in the whole universe, with the touring of the mega shows, Riverdance and Lord of the Dance, and the different productions of each of those, and then the spin-off productions. So I'd like to do some Irish, but of course, as I mentioned, the Irish goes back way before these mega shows. And I'd like to do a set of Irish reel steps, horseshoe reel steps. The first few will be fairly old traditional steps, and the next several will be a little bit more contemporary. Not quite as contemporary as Riverdance, but maybe about 10 or 15 years old. So this is a set of Irish reel steps. Hope you like it.
We'd like to play for you now a great song from the blues tradition of American music, and this dates back to the late teens of this century, and it's an old blues that has two names. It goes by the name of Atlanta Blues, and it's also known as Make Me a Pallet on the Floor.
Make me a pallet on your
What's the matter? Haven't you ever seen a grown man dressed like this before? Everybody does it in New York. It's just a normal thing. Wouldn't even get a second look in New York. You know? Anyway, you might think I'm dressed for a comedy act, but really I'm dressed for a legitimate dance, a dance that comes from South Africa, a South African boot dance, or a gumboot dance. And it's mostly the miners of South Africa who are known for doing the boot dance. And traditionally the boot dance has been a competition dance. Large groups of miners from one mine were competing against groups of miners from other mines. And sometimes these groups had 50 or even 60 men in them. Very big men, miners. So as I do this dance, you'll see that it's very percussive. It's not really a step dance. It doesn't manipulate the feet the way step and tap and clog dancing does. But it's a very percussive dance, which is my interest in it in the relationship with the other dances. But as I do these steps, and you sort of see how much stomping and clapping it is, or it contains, use your imaginations and try to amplify this by 60 times. And you'll get the image that it's an amazing spectacle to watch. And the boot dance, as I said, is done by groups, and each group has a leader who shouts out the name of the step, and then the group responds by dancing the step in unison. And the names of the steps are sometimes in Zulu and sometimes in English, so you might hear a few words that you recognize. And basically the steps go back and forth in competition, and because of the competition, some of the steps have become very long and very complex rhythmically, very polyrhythmic actually. Now the boot dance is not just a competition dance for the miners, but the boot dance is also a way for the miners to have some fun. The life of a miner in South Africa is very difficult. The miners are poor black men who come from various townships around South Africa. Some come even from beyond the border of South Africa, from neighboring countries. The men live in all male hostels. They're separated from their families sometimes for more than half a year just to make some money to send back to support their families. The pay is very low for work that's very dangerous, very difficult, and very long. So the boot dance is a way for the workers to have a release and a relief actually. It's a way of having some fun because, in a sense, it's a bit of a protest. It's playful and, in a very playful way, mocks the things that are in the environment of the miners that are oppressive to them. Such as the owners of the mines, and the police, and the military who watch over them. And you'll see this with the playful salutes and attentions. It even makes fun of industry, which is represented by the needles on electric sewing machines that go stitch. In the Zulu language, the word for boots is isikatula. So I'd like to call the boot dance isikatula. And before I do isikatula for you, I would like to mention that this is the last piece of this half of the show. We'll break for an intermission after this. And if you'd like to come up and say hello, we should all be out by the table that just so happens to have concert videos and workshop videos and books, hats, t-shirts, CDs, and cassettes on them. But you can look right over those items and speak to us, because we'll be out there manning the table ourselves. So come by and say hello. But regardless of that, we hope you'll enjoy your intermission, and we also hope you'll come back for the second half of the show. But before we let you go, this is isikatula. Attention, Welcome back for the second half of the show. Did you all practice your steps during intermission? And for those of you I saw dancing, were you practicing your steps or were you stealing my steps? Actually, it's quite all right. If you can steal them, you can have them. No problem. They're free for the taking. Anyway, we'd like to begin this second half of the show with a selection of French-Canadian tunes and dances. And the French-Canadians, in their own language, are the Québécois. They're the people of Quebec, the French-Canadians. And so we'll start off with a Québécois tune, and then follow that tune with two French-Canadian, two Québécois step dances, the first of which is known as Le Brandy. And Le Brandy is actually the name of the tune, and also the name of the social dance that goes with that tune. And Le Brandy is really, as I said, a social dance, and it's kind of like a Virginia reel, where you have a line of men facing a line of women. And it's only the end people who get to do the figures, but of course that rotates around and progresses. And so when you're not on the end, and the end people are doing the figures, you're standing in line and you do a series of steps. And that's what I'll show you, is some of the footwork that goes with Le Brandy. Now Le Brandy is in 12/8. It's a sort of, it's not that it's a rare time signature, but it's not the most common one either. And so if you notice the footwork, it's sort of a weird looking shuffle, a very specialized shuffle, and variations on it. And that is because it reflects this 12/8 time as opposed to 2/4 or 4/4 time. So I'll do Le Brandy and then follow it with a Québécois style waltz clog. So first Le Brandy, then the waltz clog, but before those two, a French-Canadian fiddle tune. Please may welcome John, Connell, and Ruthie.
now for something completely different. I'd like to play for you a beautiful song which was written in the late 1920s by one of America's greatest popular songwriters, and that is Mr. Hoagy Carmichael. And this is a song called Rocking Chair.
Old rocking chairs got me, came by my side, fetch me that ginseng, for I tan your heart. I can't get from this cabin, Judgment Day is near, chained to my rocking chained to
as I mentioned, the English style of clog dancing was another one of the parents of the American styles. So I'd like to do for you now an English clog dance. Not all English step dances are clog dances. Many of the English step dances are not done in the clogs. And when people think of English step dancing or English clogging, they frequently think of the Lancashire hornpipe. Well, really, the Lancashire hornpipe is just one example of English clogging or English step dancing. What I have for you is a hornpipe, but it's not from the county of Lancashire. It's from the next county east of Lancashire, the county of Durham. And so the styles are actually very similar, but it's a little bit different. The Durham hornpipe was always a competition form of dance. The contests were held up on top of tables, maybe about yay high off of the ground, and maybe only about 2 feet by 2 feet. So, for one thing, you had to stand on the spot and do all your steps. Otherwise, it hurt. The sounds had to be very even, and to judge this, somebody would be put underneath the table or underneath the stage, who would just simply judge the evenness of the sound, the beats. The posture had to be nice, not as tightly held as the Irish, but nice and straight and relaxed. And each step had to be done twice. Once off your right side, once off your left side. What that really translates to is once off your good side and once off your bad side. I'm sure you tap dancers and clog dancers know what I mean when I say you weren't allowed to be a one-sided dancer. So those are the rules. I think there's plenty of room underneath this stage. Feel free to belly up and get underneath if you like, but no need to. You can just sit there and relax if you prefer. Each step is done twice. I stand on the spot. I stand up nicely, and the sounds have to be even. This is a Durham-style hornpipe. Hope you like it.
going to play a little polka from Mexico. It's called Las Pecositas, the Little Freckles.
we obviously don't have any jazz fans in the audience tonight. That's quite apparent. Of course, that was an improvisation with a lot of trades and solos in there based on a blues form and interpreted as a bebop type of blues, a bebop improvisation. It was called Blues in the Closet. And I think Connell said that it's probably a basic tune. That's what we think. Are we sure, Connell?
We're not sure.
No, can't ever be 100% sure, can we? Yeah, well, we think it's a basic tune. Anyway, that bebop blues followed a very classic style of tap dance and jazz form. That was an old style soft shoe. And all the master tap dancers, all the veteran hoofers and jazz tap dancers, rhythm tap dancers could do a soft shoe. And for some of them, it was their specialty. For people like Honey Coles and Charlie Atkins, who together were known as Coles and Atkins, it really was their specialty. They were a great example of what was known as the class acts, because they dressed very debonair and suave, and they had a lot of class. And they didn't always go for fast, hard-driving rhythms, which they did, but sometimes they slowed it down. And the slower you could go, the better it was, because the power came in the control of the soft shoe. So that was the trademark of the soft shoe, to go as slowly as possible. And Honey Coles surely was one of the greatest exponents of it. Have you ever heard of Lena Horne? Yeah, Lena Horne once commented that honey could make butterflies look clumsy because of how graceful he was, and that was certainly the truth. And if anything, it was an understatement. But people like the Condos brothers, Steve Condos and Jimmy Slide and Tip Tap and Toe, Raymond Wingfield, all the classic hoofers could do a soft shoe. And of course, that was stormy weather. I don't know about where you're sitting, but right about where I'm standing, it's extremely stormy right now. Anyway, those jazz pieces, the soft shoe, the bebop blues, bring us to the last number of this evening's concert. And before I get into saying much more about this last number, there are several thank yous I'd like to extend. First of all, thank you all for coming out this evening. It's been great to perform for you. We can actually do the show without you, but it's much more fun with you here. So thank you all for coming. You've been great. Also, we'd like to thank the Pardoe Theater and its staff, and I guess in particular it was the Division of Performing Arts here at BYU that brought us in. Ken Crossley and his whole staff, we'd like to say thank you to. And it takes a lot of work to set up and run a show like this, so in particular we'd like to thank the folks who are running the show and help set us up. We have on sound Heidi, on lights Liz, and let's see, I guess that's really the staff that's running the show. So please, a big thank you to this. They've done a great job all 4 nights here. And in particular, I'd like to thank the musicians, think about and thank the musicians, not only for tonight's concert, but in general. It's the music that inspires these dances. The music is there first, and people then start expressing it in dance. And once the dance exists, you can do it with different music, and you can change things around. But originally, this stuff wouldn't be around without the music first. So I have 3 mighty fine musicians with me this evening, and I feel very fortunate when I can get these 3 musicians together. They're a great band together, and they're great musicians in their own right, all involved in their own projects. And they all come from different places, so we don't see each other that much, but it sure is fun to get together. So, all the way from the beautiful western part of North Carolina, the city of Asheville, on banjo, vocals, mandolin, and bass, Mr. John Herman. Thank you, John. John is actually originally from Baltimore. Do you know what that makes him? He's a Baltimorean, everybody. I didn't make that up. That's legit. That's legit. Right. Thank you. And all the way from the very moist state of Seattle, well, Washington State, the city of Seattle. Though I first met Ruthie when she just got back from Europe, and she was in Vermont for a little bit trying to think of what to do, and she wound up settling in Boston. So I know her originally from the East Coast, but she moved back to the Northwest where she's originally from. So from Seattle on fiddle and big hair, right, Ruthie? It's Ruthie Dornfeld. Thank you. And all the way from the small hamlet of Loughborough, England. I met him when he was living in London, slightly larger hamlets, also in England, but now he lives in an even slightly larger hamlet called New York City. On the piano, he's our Mr. Jazz Man. He also did some vocals tonight, Mr. Connell Phelps. Now, Connell, I have this sense that tonight would be the best. It's worth a try. Okay, now, you know, when we Americans go overseas to England, we say things like Loughborough and Edinburgh and Marlborough, but that's not where Connell's from. Connell's from Loughborough. Loughborough. So we would like to humor Connell right now, and we would like to say Loughborough all together here so he can really hear us make an effort to correct how Americans usually say Loughborough. So on the count of three, everybody, Loughborough. 1, 2, 3. Loughborough! You know, I should actually say, I'm originally from Malvern, which would be Malvern, right? I won't, right? Malvern? Could you bring John's mic up there?
I'd like to test Connell. It's one of my favorite English expressions. What do you call that piano style? You know, like.
That's boogie woogie.
Wait, I've heard most English people call it boogie woogie. Boogie woogie. All right, moving right along, ladies and gentlemen. We do have a last number of the concert to do tonight. This last number I like to call the American Suite. It's got 3 sections to it that sum up the 2 American styles of percussive step dancing, clogging and also tap dancing. And in particular, the interpretations of those that I dance is the flat-foot style of clogging and some rhythm tap dancing. So thanks again. You've been a great audience. It's been a really wonderful run here at the Pardoe Theater. It's a great way to finish up with such a nice audience. So I hope you enjoyed this last number, and maybe we'll see you again sometime. This is the American Suite.